Hey, check it, kids. I'm back. Well, not really. I'm kind of out with shingles, so I'm going to be giving you a lesson today um, through this video. So, last class we ended with, not last class, but last time we ended with talking about Germany's reintegration into the international scene. We talked about the Ruhr crisis. We talked about the Locarno, the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and the whole issues that transpired after the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. Well, a lot of what we talked about was dealing mainly with Germany, but right now we're going to look at international affairs. And one of the main concepts, one of the 14 points behind the Treaty of Versailles was disarmament and the freedom of the seas. And this is where the whole naval disarmament comes in between 1921 to 1936 with the spirit of the Covenant of the League of Nations. We'll be talking about the naval disarmament. So the objectives include what were the attempts to seek naval disarmament following the end of World War I, and we will also evaluate how successful these efforts were. In the Washington Naval Conference in 1921 and 1922, this was the major conference that took place after. Think of it, it's almost like the Treaty of Versailles of the ocean, where they basically had a number of nations meet in Washington, D.C. to discuss the reduction of naval arms and as well as alleviating tensions in East Asia, because at that time Japan was getting very strong and China was also an ally in World War I. They sent a good number of people over to help dig in the trenches, since they really don't have much of a military to boast about. And so they were both on the ally side, and they're both on the victor side as well. Over World War I, the U.S. Navy expanded considerably, mainly because of its industrial prowess, but also due to factors such as the convoy system, where America needed to send aid to Europe, and they needed to build ships for that, a convoy system to protect their supplies. However, America did not want to continue spending massive amounts of money on a naval race, so they wanted to keep expenditures down. Meanwhile, Japan was the new superstar of the Pacific, and they had a pretty strong navy. They beat the Russians in 1905 in the Russo-Japanese War, and they also have kind of like a promise between Britain and Japan. And Britain, of course, cannot be underestimated, and this was in the Anglo-Japanese alliance of 1902. Britain, the naval power, wanted to maintain its naval predominance, but because of World War I was heavily in debt, and as we saw in the whole Young and Dawes plan, that whole triangle, Britain was not in a very good financial shape, and did not want to be dragged into a war between the U.S. and Japan if anything breaks out. And according to the Anglo-Japanese alliance in 1902, they're technically obligated to join in. And so they don't want to, of course the British did not want to fight the Americans, so something needed to be done about that alliance. Japan, meanwhile, wanted to expand its empire, but did not want to mess with the USA. On the other hand, they already kind of have a foothold in Korea from winning the Sino-Japanese War in 1895. They eyed Siberia for their supplies because only 16% of Japan could actually you could actually grow rice. There's no iron, no coal, not a lot of stuff in Japan for industrialization, and therefore they needed to look outwards to expand, to maintain their industrialization and also their growing economy, getting resources to make their stuff, They also need to find markets. The whole cycle of imperialism they need to maintain. And for resources, Siberia is great. Manchuria is good. Korea is excellent for rice, and China is great for a big market. However, they did not want to fight with the U.S. So there were a couple of treaties. Think of it as the 5, 4, and 9, or 4, 5, 9, or whatever order of numbers you want. That's good for you. But the Five Powers Treaty was a treaty where there was an agreement between the U.S., British, and Japanese, and the French, and the Italians, in that they would maintain a 553, 1.67, 1.67 ratio for their ships. And this is for their capital ship tonnage. And that means capital ships were ships that exceeded 10,000 tons or have guns in excess of an 8-inch caliber, meaning their bullets are, the cannons, the guns, and an 8-inch. I'm not sure if it's a diameter. I think it's diameter. No, I think it's a radius. And effectively, and because this 10,000 ton classification, it effectively denotes the difference between a battleship and an aircraft carrier. These limitations do not apply to cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. And you must be wondering, what's the difference between a battleship, cruiser, and destroyer? A battleship is like those super dreadnoughts that they were racing with. During that time, not a lot of countries could had them. Pretty much, it was Britain and Germany that obviously had the most because of their naval arms race. Cruisers are the minimal. They're not minimal. They're seen as the minimal operational ships, meaning that these cruisers are ships that have to be they have to be big, and because they need to be able to carry operations. And so if you send a cruiser somewhere, this cruiser is supposed to be able to carry out an operation to accomplish a certain goal by itself. And so it's significantly big, but it's not as big as a battleship. A destroyer, on the other hand, is meant to be quick, and it's meant to have a combat capabilities to ward off attacks or to attack other people. So if you're having and destroyers are also supposed to last to be very long enduring. So if you're protecting a convoy system, you would use destroyers. Obviously, submarines, you know what they are, and aircraft carriers are carriers that carry aircraft. But here's one thing that really changed between World War I and World War II. World War I was a war where air power really did not play a very big role. Yes, it really triggered the Battle of the Marne, and there was a lot of reconnaissance and so on. But and of course the dogfights. But it really did not play a big role until World War II, when people started realizing, hey, aircraft carriers are the future. You can have one aircraft carrier carry a bunch of planes, and these planes could all just crowd and rush a battleship. Essentially, one battleship cannot take on a bunch of planes at the same time. And so, therefore, the aircraft carriers are really useful. I was trying to think of an analogy. Think of a bunch of mosquitoes swarming around your head. Okay, if you are a battleship and a bunch of mosquitoes are the aircraft carriers, they're going to take a beating on you, especially if you're dropping bombs and not just sucking blood. Bad example, but you get the point. So the Five Powers Treaty, there was essentially no mechanism established to reinforce this. However, it's in the spirit of collective security. It was agreed upon. The U.S., Japan, and Britain agreed not to strengthen their bases in the Pacific. Britain nor the U.S. could build new naval bases within 300 miles of Japan, and this was done basically to appease Japanese fears. The Japanese did not want to mess with Britain or the U.S., and nor did they want them to interfere with their sphere of influence. And so having this agreement really put everyone at ease. And of course, they did the obligatory destruction of their constructions, such as, you know, the Americans got rid of 26 ships, the British got rid of 24, the Japanese got rid of 19. But really the question that comes into mind is, which side had to gain or lose the most from this treaty? What do you see as potential loopholes in this treaty? Which nations were not part of this treaty? I want you guys to spend 3 minutes discussing each question, all right, in your table group. So, and based on how I understand you guys are probably divided into three guys and 3 girls right now. So while you guys in your table groups just discuss how each of these questions, all right? So let's pause the video right here and come back and restart it in 9 minutes. Pause. Okay, 9 minutes have passed. So the question number 1 is, which side had to gain or lose the most from this treaty? If you look at these numbers, Japan really had a lot to gain because the USA and the British really could, well, not the British, the USA could really mass produce their ships to really pretty much outrun any of these countries in building a navy. Japan would be pretty happy because America would, because of this, would not outrun all of them. USA, with on the same point, would be happy to not outrun them because they didn't want to spend the money in the first place. Britain would be happy because Britain somehow, even though they don't have the industrial power to really keep up with the Americans, they still keep their naval supremacy by being on par with the USA. And Japan also is pretty happy because they get within a pretty good distance with Britain and the USA. So the top 3 countries are overall seen to be, you know, pretty happy with this whole deal. France and Italy, on the other hand, are interesting because you see France being seen as historically as one of the main powers of Europe is now having to agree to a deal to having a smaller naval size compared to Japan, and it is an indication of the change in times. And it's also interesting because Italy here, with their being seen as, you know, in World War I they were seen as half power, are now on par with France, and so it's also a reflection of the changing times. Next question. What do you see as potential loopholes in this treaty? Well, the obvious one is there's no way to enforce anything. Meaning, meaning if someone decides to break it, there's no way to check it. It's not like America's. Sorry, it's not America. How about, it's not like Japan is going to let Americans go into their, you know, naval base and say, hey, check out my tonnage. You know, how much tonnage you got? Okay, let's match them. It's pretty much impossible to do that because no one in their sane mind would invite another person to, you know, check out their navy. There's also the whole question is, how do you classify ships? For example, the definition of a cruiser and this later on comes up as a problem in the 1927 Geneva Naval Conference. But an example of this would be America had fewer but larger cruisers, while Britain had more but smaller cruisers. You know, just the whole definition of what these boats are is a question. Each country have their own way of creating their boats. It's almost like telling Toyota and Hyundai to agree on, you know, a way to classify their cars. You know, it's not going to happen. Another question is the improving technology. You have with the whole issue of setting a ratio for capital ships. It is mainly for battleships and aircraft carriers, but you know, aircraft carriers. You know, if you build one aircraft carrier, it could essentially, you know, counter a whole bunch of battleships, and so everyone will be racing to build aircraft carriers. On the other hand, Another loophole would be, what if you improve a cruiser to be stronger than a battleship? I mean, cruisers nowadays, probably a more exaggerated example would be destroyers nowadays. Destroyers being those long and fast traveling boats. These boats are much more powerful than cruisers back then. So just think, 40 years later, the whole definition of these things may change. So time is an issue with improving technology. And of course, like I mentioned before, the role of the aircraft carrier really does obviate any of the other types of ships at that time. And another one would be like, submarines. What if Japan decides to build a whole bunch of submarines? This 5-5-3 ratio does not govern submarines, or like I said before, cruisers or destroyers. Next thing is, which nations were not part of this conference? A couple of obvious ones would be the USSR, and obviously because the USSR was communist, and they're in East Asia and in Europe as well, but because they're communists, they were not invited, and they really had no say, just like they had no say in the League of Nations until until later on, and they had no say in the Treaty of Versailles. Germany, as of 1921, was not welcome yet, and because because Germany really reintegrates itself with the Treaty of Locarno, and another major country that was not involved in this would be China, because China would be really, it's not an issue. It's too weak, but even though it carries a huge part of the coastline in East Asia, but they were too weak, and simply Japan wouldn't want them in there anyways. Okay, next part, the four-power agreement. This agreement was signed between France, Britain, Japan, and US, basically to guarantee each nation its territorial possessions in East Asia. And of course, let's see. They also agreed to protect each other in the case of an external attack. And one of the main things about this agreement, as I mentioned earlier, was Britain did not want to get involved between a fight between Japan and the U.S. And with the four-power agreement, this canceled the Anglo-Japanese alliance of 1902 and made it so that everyone is essentially obligated to protect one another and agreed to protect each other in case of an external attack, and also amongst themselves. In the case of France, they had territories in Indochina, which would mean Cambodia and Vietnam. Britain would have territory in Hong Kong and other parts of Southeast Asia. Japan, obviously, in Japan. Korea and Shandong province in China, and the U.S., having their huge piece on the eastern coast of the eastern part of the Pacific. And so the nations agreed on their territorial possessions in the Pacific, and they agreed to settle this disputes by diplomacy and possibly consider joint action against other aggressor nations as well. And so this is the four-power agreement. The next and final one would be the nine-power agreement, and it was signed by the U.S., Britain, Japan, France, Italy, China, Portugal, Netherlands, and Belgium. And this essentially confirmed the open door policy in regard to trade in China. China, in this time, the Qing dynasty fell in the early 1912 or 1911. I don't quite remember the exact date. But it fell during that time, and so China was really just reintegrating itself back into the international market, and this was also a warlord's era in China. So basically, only the ports of China really had any international connections, and for the most part, China was a big mess at that time internally. So there was the issue of protecting China. And this is what the Nine Power Agreement was basically about. It's about protecting China and promising to keep its territorial integrity sound. So that no one could really come in and take China apart during that time. In a separate treaty, Japan also needed to return Shandong to China, and of course, this was not something that they were happy about, because according to the Treaty of Versailles, Shandong was given to Japan. According to the Nine Power Agreement, Japan had to return Shandong to China. The Chinese were happy, but the Japanese felt that Shandong was supposed to be their rightful, reward for helping fight the Germans in World War I in China. And so this was the Nine Power Agreement, and so they essentially agreed, as it states in the bottom here, guaranteeing Chinese sovereignty, Shandong returning to China, and also an open door policy for China for trade. So that was the Washington Naval Conference, and everyone was happy and jolly and so on. Of course, there's really no way to enforce any of this, but as you will notice, that is mostly the case for all the other treaties signed during this time. But we'll move on. In 1927, there was the Geneva Naval Conference to attempt to apply the 5-3-3, 1.67, 1.67 ratio to cruisers as well. However, this failed because the U.S. had fewer but larger cruisers, while Britain had more but smaller cruisers, and there was really just a huge problem in agreeing and setting the ratio, as I mentioned earlier. In 1930, there was a London Naval Conference, which was a readjustment in the naval tonnage of the major powers from 553 to 1010.7, because really 1010.7, this was almost like basic math. From 553 to 1010.7, basically Japan increased their production of their naval arms to 3.5 from the original Washington Naval Agreement deal. And 10-10-10 parity was given in regards to submarines. They finally decided to classify cruisers as light and heavy cruisers, which was a problem in the 1927 Geneva Conference. And there were also limitations placed on the sizes, on the size and limitation of destroyed cruisers and submarines. So they finally tried to get their act together in classifying and creating kind of a universal understanding of what these ships are called. And there were also new rules put in place concerning submarine warfare. In 1935, the Anglo-German naval agreement was made between Britain and Germany, and by this time Germany has more or less reintegrated itself into international affairs. But the problem is this: by this time Hitler was also in power, and Hitler was rebuilding the German army, pretty much. And Britain, and through this agreement, Britain basically agreed to allow Germany to have a naval fleet up to 35% of British tonnage and a submarine fleet of up to 45% of British tonnage. What do you see as problematic about this agreement? I'm going to give you 2 minutes to consider this, alright? So in your groups, pause the video and discuss this. Pause. Alright, so 2 minutes is up. And what do you see as problematic about this agreement? It's very problematic because here you have Britain unilaterally breaking the whole restriction on naval arms from the Treaty of Versailles. According to the Treaty of Versailles, remember, Germany was to be stripped of its navy. And here you have Britain pretty much agreeing to give Germany a navy. And this really caused a lot of troubles for a lot of countries because they obviously weren't happy with this. And later on, this Anglo-German naval agreement will also come into play when we look at the causes of World War II and the whole process of appeasement. But nonetheless, since this whole video is about naval disarmament, we'll leave it at that. And finally, there was the 1936 London Naval Conference. In 1934, Japan had already given its intention to terminate the five-power agreement as it sought to build up its empire in the Pacific. Later on, I'll be talking about Manchuria and the whole problems in Manchuria and how Japan and the League of Nations basically went its separate ways on this issue, and Japan went in and took Manchuria while the League of Nations really couldn't do much about it. The 1936 conference essentially fails when Italy and Japan walks out of the conference. Italy, like I said before, Japan was having issues with Manchuria. Italy, on the other hand, was having problems with Abyssinia, and it's these two things that really show the League of Nations' weakness. And we'll be looking at this in the next class. And with the 1936 London Naval Conference, this basically ends the era of naval limitations. So, yep, that's it.